Billy Surly, how are you?
I'm okay. Hi, Danny.
Welcome to Economist on Zoom Getting Coffee.
Pleasure to be here. Here's my coffee cup.
Let's see. All right.
Can you see? It's Chekhov.
Yeah.
Oh, something's weird happening with my fake background.
Yeah, but
it's
I
my
think
Chekhov coffee cup.
Good. Well, I just have a Harvard mug just because we cannot talk a lot about people who teach or taught at Harvard, I think. Bill, I'm excited to have you in the show. I did spend the last month and a half reading your latest two books.
Oh my gosh.
In fact, I have. Yeah, it was fun. It was really fun. It was definitely better than watching the news just in the last month of President Trump's presidency.
Well, that's a pretty low standard. I think I can beat that one.
Yeah, you have a good point. Yeah. And it made me think a lot. I consider myself a development economist, and it was so thought-provoking. Your first book, which is it's your second book, but the first one I read in the past month, which is the White Man's Burden. It's the second time I read it. I read it the first time as a student, and I think this time I was able to really enjoy it more and made me think a lot about how I teach development. I teach a small course in development, and made me think maybe I should change the syllabus a little bit for next year. And then I read the Tyranny of Experts, which I have here, and everybody who's watching should think about definitely reading this if you are interested in development. And yeah, it also, of course, very thought-provoking. It made me think a lot. So I guess I want to start with a big question for you, which is, has anything changed for the better, maybe, since you wrote these books? Do you think your books have had some impact on how development economists think and approach the world?
So I think things in development have gotten better in a lot of ways. I mean, if you mean by development, actually achieving development, having, good economic growth, having countries actually getting richer, getting more healthy, getting better educated. I think the trends on all those things have been quite positive. Of course, not now with the COVID depression worldwide,
right?
Of course, but the long run trends in those areas, which have continued, except for the pandemic, have continued from year to year, have been quite positive in all regions. I mean, Africa is the one that development economists have historically worried about the most. But Africa's had very good economic growth and has always had, a very strong trend improvement in getting clean water and education, and all those indicators like infant mortality have gotten a lot better. There have been successes like eliminating smallpox, and more recently making a lot of progress on malaria and treating HIV/AIDS. And so, there's been a lot of successes in development. And I think, since development economists and aid officials work on those things, I think we have some credit to spread around to those actors. They deserve some credit for what they've been doing. And of course, a lot of the success is also homegrown. So right. I think we have to give a lot of credit to, domestic leaders, activists, citizens in poor countries.
Right. So, in talking about credit, one of the big takeaways for me, and I think that for you too, I guess, as you spell it out in your conclusions of both books, is the importance of rights for the poor. Is maybe that, to paraphrase yourself, if I may, that a lot of what causes development is what you just said, the ability from bottom up to for everybody to reach their full potential. And there is a limited space for government or the World Bank or development institutions, which I want to touch upon. But I guess there's a lot of things that I think have happened in that direction. since you wrote the book. I think the book was written in 2005. And there's this, you speak very eloquently and very good about the academics in the field in general. And you say they've been doing a lot of great work on trying to find evidence and very rigorously on what works, what doesn't work. And you talk a little bit about cash transfer programs that are conditional. In your book, in the first book, or in the White Man's Burden, you talk about conditional cash transfers. But there is a big movement now of unconditional cash transfers.
It's funny, Danny. I was sort of afraid to talk about unconditional cash transfers in the White Man's Burden back 15 years ago. It was too crazy and radical an idea at that time, and I actually mentioned it briefly in one paragraph. If I was allowed to be selective, I would now highlight that paragraph a lot. So, why don't we try unconditional cash transfers? That could work.
Right.
And let's test and see if it actually does work. I said that, but it was only one paragraph.
It was very crazy at the time. But today, it seems like it's the most promising form of development. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but it's definitely a very, very promising.
Yeah, well, I think one thing we have to talk about is what is aid and what is development. I think of them as two separate things. That aid is just anything that people with more money can do to help people with less money. And of course, there are a lot of things that fall into that category, and there's a lot of good things people with more money can do for people with less money. So cash transfer is obviously in that category. And by development, I think we mean something much more bigger and more ambitious. The whole transformation of a whole country into, a much richer place with much better institutions, with rights for the citizens, like you were mentioning, with infrastructure, with a public health service, with permanent kind of track for long-run economic growth to go from being a poor country to becoming a rich country. So I think that's what we mean by development. And frankly, the cash transfers, for example, are great for aid. I don't think they're necessarily going to do much for development.
Is it fair to ask back, is that because there's still a whole context, a whole environment of markets that maybe don't function well, or institutions, as you said, that the people, even if they have the cash to invest, it's just not going to have the highest returns that they could have?
Right, exactly. So if you think of cash transfers as a charity program, then that seems easy enough. You just identify poor people and give cash transfers. If you think of it as a development program, you have to ask what you just said. Would the cash really be invested in a permanent way? And of course, that was the original idea of the big push out of the poverty trap, as if you could just give lots of money to a poor country to be able to invest, and that would generate growth and permanent development. Now, that idea has never worked out very well.
Yes.
Very few countries would fit that story.
Your book is very convincing about that.
maybe South Korea, and almost nobody else. And lots of cash poured into countries with that hope that did not generate growth. And I think maybe the best evidence on this is just that we've really stopped talking about that altogether in recent years.
Right.
Very few people are today holding out any hope that a large cash aid program would generate permanent investment and much higher growth that would create, permanent prosperity.
Right. So on that note, I guess that that's maybe the reasoning, or some of the reasoning, for an organization like the World Bank or other regional banks to say, well, we also come with the technical expertise to be able to fix or improve those conditions that are needed for the poor people to reach their full potential. But that's something that you also criticize to some extent.
Yeah, that idea has been around for a long time. 25 years ago at the World Bank, I remember us talking about that idea, that maybe our aid's not working that well, but our wonderful technical advice will transform poor countries permanently into rich countries. That idea did not work out too well either.
I can see a lot of the things you're talking, but I want to push back with one idea, which is the way I learned about development, and I give credit, hopefully it's credit to Danny Roderick, is that maybe the big question that you have to ask is, the way I teach it to my students too, is WTF, which is what's the failure? Right? And, you have countries, you have countries that are, you were saying before, you could have a lot of cash transfers, but if the context is not right, if you can invest just a small part of in your farm, but then you cannot get the rest of the credit from the bank because there's no bank to give you credit, even though your returns would be potentially very high, or if there's no bridges or roads to export your farms. And there is a role. There are tons of market failures.
Yes,
in developing countries, I think it's fair to say that.
Yeah,
and there is a role for government. Maybe it is the role of government to fix those market failures. I know it's a very hard task to identify them and find the right way to fix them, but maybe perhaps here the technical approach makes a lot of sense, because maybe there is a role for the knowledge that has accrued in the World Bank and all these institutions to come and say, this is the way to approach this market failure and fix it. Is that a good middle ground, or you think that that's like too much?
Well, so I'm very sympathetic to market failures. There are lots of market failures. It's completely obvious. What I would push back on is we cannot have an idealized picture where there's some, perfect government apparatus or official or structure that can zero in on the market failure and flawlessly do just exactly the right thing to correct market failure. Because there's also government failure. So what is government failure? It's any kind of corruption, inefficiency, anything that interferes with the government's ability to do public goods or to correct market failures. So maybe we need to step back a little bit and talk about the big picture. What are the kind of systems that would work well in both government and markets? I think we get kind of stuck in this endless debate on government versus markets, government intervention versus laissez-faire, that kind of thing. And I think that's not quite the right debate. What we really want is some kind of system that, corrects both government failures and market failures. And I think the one we want to think about is precisely the one that gives a lot of rights to poor people. When poor people have political rights, they can hold their government leaders and officials accountable to provide them with high quality public goods. When they have economic rights and, there are rights that prevent corporations from becoming themselves coercive or monopolistic, then the consumers can hold corporations accountable for delivering things they want to buy, because they can drive out of business any business that is not providing them what they want to buy. Right. And so, with rights, you have a system that allows both governments to work better and markets to work better. And I think that's the correct debate, is rights versus no rights.
So do you see, I'm trying to think if there's anything of what 8 agencies are doing or have done in the past decade or more on that direction.
Well, certainly the 8 agencies and the World Bank and everyone in the development is aware of this issue, the need for accountability to the citizens. It's actually very difficult for 8 agencies, including the World Bank, to intervene for a couple of reasons. One is that the World Bank is really owned by its members. And by its members, we mean the member governments.
Right.
So, it's very hard for the World Bank to go in and say, this is a tyrannical government, overthrow the government. And I don't think they should really do that. But obviously they couldn't, even if we thought campaigning for rights of the citizens in a tyrannical country was a good thing, the World Bank would not be able to do that because that tyrannical government is on the board of the World Bank. And they are, the tyrannical government is the boss of the World Bank. They're not going to let the boss is not going to let their underling go around saying, overthrow the boss. That's not going to happen.
Right.
And second, to make it even worse, the rich countries that might have been expected to be somewhat more charitable and open towards the rights of poor people in poor countries, they also have their own interests, especially the US and the UK during the war on terror have been very eager to recruit allies, and often autocratic governments make the best allies because they don't have to worry about satisfying their own citizen. They can do deals with rich country governments, the US and the UK. And so some of the worst examples of autocratic violations of rights and development projects happen because they're sort of getting cover from their rich country patrons.
So if you were to, and I don't know if you have been asked this question many times, but if you had the power to, redo the whole, to redo the whole, it's a very difficult task, but to redo the whole development arena and, redo the World Bank or close it or reopen it and all the different institutions, what would you do? Because you are still saying that there is a space for advocating for the right policies. And some people in the World Bank will say, well, that's what we do. We're trying to define, what based on, I don't know if based on intuition or on data or a mix of both, like these are the right policies that you should do, but that still hasn't worked out.
Yeah. I love that question. And of course, that's a very, very common question. I've gotten it hundreds of times in my career as everybody else. So I've been puzzled how to answer that. I guess my best answer is, well, I would just immediately fire myself.
Okay, fair enough.
I shouldn't have that power. There's no way I should have that power. There's no way anybody like me should have that power.
Fair enough.
So it's sort of like, in your big critique of top-down policy, what would you do if you were at the top doing policy down? No, I don't want to go there.
So that means is it fair to say you think that there's really no role for these agencies? I mean, we might be better off by just closing them down, except for the part of the trading that you're saying, which can be achieved, as we said before, with much less money.
If you were really insisting that they had to that they could only stay open if they did the major transformational development stuff that they were originally supposed to do, then it's probably hopeless for them to ever do that. They're never going to live up to that. They have never lived up to that in the past. They never will in the future. If you're willing to give them a more modest role, basically the supervisors of international philanthropy and a participant themselves in international philanthropy, in which they're doing sort of small scale projects to help poor people, like we were talking about cash transfers before, or giving out medicines. Like right now is an obvious big aid opportunity to just, help poor countries get vaccines for COVID. That's like an obvious opening, but that's really more about philanthropy and relief than it is about development. So if you're willing to shrink their ambitions to be about philanthropy and charity and poverty relief and emergency relief, then I think they could do okay at that, and they're already doing okay at that.
We're running out of time, so I want to ask maybe just a couple more questions. One is that you do mention a lot about the work of many of our colleagues who are doing like great, the big picture, the fact that a lot of development economists in academia are doing a great job on evaluating programs and maybe they're more humble with understanding the reach of their conclusions. And a lot of this has been, or a big chunk of what development economics is today. I think it's fair to say it's RCTs, randomized controlled trials. And I think that this is a debate that it has a lot of mixed feelings in economics. I think that, of course, there's, it's a great way to look at the evidence, very rigorous, or it's the gold standard basically. There's also people who criticize it by saying, yeah, this is great. These are good and interesting questions, but there's very little we can actually learn about the world if we just look at a very tiny experiment on a very tiny question. And it's not that I think that, I'm just repeating what others say. And I wonder where you stand in that debate, because I'm sure that you know people on both sides. And and I wonder what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I have very mixed feelings on this. So
I thought so. That's why
I'm very very torn. So let's put it back in what we were just talking about. Are RCTs about aid or about development? Are RCTs about philanthropy or are they about development? I think if they were about philanthropy, then I think they're doing pretty well. I think they're a good way to have a kind of independent evaluation on the NGOs and on the aid agencies, whether they're actually doing what they're supposed to, or at least they could be that. And so, they're definitely a positive development compared to the kind of, big conflict of interest in which the aid agencies were doing their own self-evaluations, very, very unscientific methodologies in which they wound up praising themselves on the basis of no evidence whatsoever. So compared to that, RCTs are a big advance. But are they really about development? So that's again the big divide. I think people who care a lot about development, like our mutual friend Lant Pritchett, thinks, wow, this is he asked a good question, which is, has any country ever developed using RCTs? That's a good question. They have been around for decades. It's not like they were a brand new invention. So that's a great question. No, the answer is no. No country has developed using RCTs. Is it likely any country will develop in the future based on RCTs? With a very heavy weight for RCTs, it doesn't seem that likely, because they're not doing the kind of big questions that would really contribute. If we think development is mainly about good institutions like property rights and democratic freedoms and all those good things, then there's very little that RCTs can do about those big issues. They can't test big issues. We can't have experiments in which one country is oppressed by a brutal tyrant and the other has beautiful democratic freedoms, and say, what does the RCT tell us about the effect of democratic freedoms? That would not be ethical or feasible. So it doesn't seem likely they're going to be of much help on the big development questions.
Right.
But yeah, they're great for guiding philanthropy, and I think philanthropy is a good thing.
Well, thank you, Bill. This has been super interesting. For
thank
all
you,
of you
Danny.
Watching, you should, if you're interested in development, read all of Bill's books, which we're gonna write down here in the comments. And we really look forward to seeing what else are you gonna produce and what advice who you don't want to give you can give us.
Thanks, Danny.
Thank you.
Great to talk to you.